transhumanizing is something that interests me because the word was actually coined by Dante in the Divine Comedy. So when I was thinking and writing about the Divine Comedy, it was very fascinating to see how the word was originally used by him. It occurs at the end of the Purgatory when, with Beatrice, he is preparing to move into the heavenly realms of the paradise, and he coins the word transhumare to begin to suggest how that might be possible. And what's so fascinating is that nowadays the way that the word is used is with subtle distortions of Dante's original intent. There's a lot that is indicative of what Dante was suggesting about how to transhumanize, but in the way the word has been twisted, particularly in the way that the word is now used within the flatland ontology of materialism, technological progress. The key element of transhumanizing that Dante thought was the heart of it has got lost. So I thought it'd be worth considering half a dozen areas in which this happens to question the modern notion of transhumanizing and, with luck, illuminating what Dante originally meant, and so bring the promise of transhumanizing back into our vision. The first area that I think this mistake is made is in relation to telepathy. When it comes to technological transhumanizing, telepathy is taken to be a network effect. The idea might be that we would all have implants in our brains, and that through the capacity of electronics to read what's going on in our neurons, we'll be able to communicate instantly across an inner internet, if you like. Wouldn't even need the screen, just be able to transmit information directly from one brain to another. And this is mistaken, whether or not it's technologically possible or put to one side, but this is mistaken in Dante's view because it's a kind of telepathy that is one-to-one. And in the Divine Comedy, particularly in the Paradise, telepathy takes place in a completely different way. It's triangulated. The broad idea is the more that the human soul becomes porous to the divine life, the more that they also receive information, insight, more importantly, felt connection and a sharing of life with those around. So Beatrice knows what's on Dante's mind because she is porous to the divine mind. And also, another really important facet of this is that the telepathy comes about not because of mechanical data exchange, but because of emotional joining. The more that Beatrice and Dante are in sympathy, the more this telepathy occurs, and so also with the souls that Dante meets on the way. And interestingly, this chimes with the findings, the scientific findings, that to all intents and purposes have proven empirically, in fact, that telepathy occurs. You can find this out if you read any measured assessment of these things. I was just reading a fairly recent book called How Woo Woo Works, and he puts together all the evidence and concludes that it's not that it happens, but quite what happens and how it happens that matters. The what is everything from quite vivid information exchange to much more commonly things like synchronicities, the sense that some things happen, the sense that you're being stared at, the sense that someone's about to arrive. And the how, very interestingly, is deeply connected to emotional connection. The more you are connected to someone by proximity of feeling, the more you're likely to be in telepathic communication. And so that shares with Dante's sense that this emotional felt sympathy, the sense of oneness with someone, is a first step towards telepathic capacities increasing. But that oneness is because there's a sharing in the divine oneness, in the unity of all things, which is what becomes quite explicit to Dante in the Divine Comedy. So, telepathy, when it comes to transhumanizing, is, I think, one key indicator, but rather than the network effect of one-to-one communication, which of course can create bubbles that are against another bubble that causes social breakdown ultimately, Dante's transhumanizing telepathy is because the oneness of all things is increasingly known as prior to the telepathic experience, of which we get an intimation with the telepathy that we experience through emotional connection now. First point, telepathy. Second area in which modern transhumanizing tends to go wrong, but Dante had different insights, is in relation to happiness. Transhumanizing nowadays is a promise of happiness, perhaps through limitless energy as a result of technological advance, perhaps through all our material needs being delivered, again through technological advance. But the happiness that underpins these promises is perceived in terms of pleasure, often then reduced to assumptions about the way that the brain works. But broadly speaking, the transhumanist promise of the future is that we will feel more up than we do down. And that has an obvious allure. But for Dante, there is the promise of happiness with the transhumanizing that he experiences in the paradise, but it's framed in a very different way. It's framed actually through the capacity to share the felt lives of those around, and in particular to know with them what draws them more and more into life. So this is the stress being put not on happiness per se, but on love and on beauty, and on suffering in the sense of being open to more and more of life. So, for example, it's quite striking in the paradise that as Dante transhumanizes, he becomes more and more open to the darkness of reality as much as he does to the light. But he knows that because he's open now to this darkness, not out of fear, as he was in the Inferno, but out of being able to say yes to life, that the love and the beauty that he experiences more and more of too is able to contain that darkness and suffering. That is the nature of paradise, and that is the nature of the way that his suffering previously has been transhumanized. It's not straightforwardly just feeling happier, it's more subtly about being able to say more and more yes to life, and knowing in that yes that love and beauty can absorb darkness and suffering. So that again is a way in which modern transhumanizing is kind of half on to the true sense, but gets it wrong. And in getting it wrong, again, a bit like the telepathy that actually breaks people down, this kind of pursuit of pleasure for pleasure's sake will also cause breakdowns because it doesn't want to say yes to life, but it wants to say no to the part of life that it doesn't deem delivers pleasure. And of course, that rapidly becomes saying no to human beings who are living desperate, difficult lives. And so the promise of eugenics rapidly follows in the path of this modern transhumanizing, because you have to breed out those who are deemed, for example, incapable of happiness, as was quite a common thought in the middle of the 20th century, were more alert to those eugenic manifestations of this reduced to transhumanising and so are wary of them. But divisions within humanity are never far from the transhumanising dream now. You know, the happiness of those who will be able to escape the confines of Earth and go and live elsewhere in the solar system, if not the galaxy, is another way in which the human species will likely split if this vision of transhumanising is followed. And so again, Dante's really matters. This is actually not about being at war with yourself or with your fellows, but is about being able to say yes to all that you're experiencing and yes to all your fellows, because you know that love and beauty can embrace the whole of life, and that embrace is more and more robust and can be trusted because it doesn't need to get rid of things. A different way, again, in which Dante's transhumanising has been perverted in the modern conception. A third area has to do with intelligence. Now again, this is very fascinating because modern transhumanising is built on, in part, the capture of increasing amounts of data and then using algorithms and artificial intelligence to spot the patterns that can build new ways of manipulating and developing the data. You see this particularly in the tremendous developments in, say, DeepMind, this artificial intelligence that has most recently been celebrated for folding or understanding how proteins fold within human cells particularly, and then comes the promise of great medical advances as a result. It seems like a form of transhumanising because of the promise that we'll be able to overcome the diseases that otherwise afflict us. And again, why wouldn't that be attractive? But Dante is onto a different kind of intelligence. Not, you might say, artificial intelligence, but the kind of intelligence that generates insight, that knows not just about how to manipulate the material world, but knows of new ways in which the world itself works, the way that the cosmos actually is, that arise from intuition, inspiration, imagination, these more participative, immersive kinds of intelligence. And it's not just Dante in the 13th century, 14th century that was trying to articulate this kind of intelligence. It's continued into the modern period amongst scientists, if no one else. So, for example, Einstein is celebrated for his celebration of the imagination because he argued it was trusting that the imagination which we have is there to help us connect with the cosmos that led him to his imaginative play when it came to riding on beams of light in his imagination, that led then to the insights of special and then general relativity. It's intuition, inspiration, trusting the imagination and working out how to play and develop that led to the advances that Einstein gave rise to. And whilst there's no doubt that there'll be technological advances by artificial intelligences, there are physicists, particularly now, who are arguing that physics itself may not much advance in terms of its fundamental understandings, in terms of new paradigm shifts, unless this more imaginative, inspirational kind of intelligence is fostered. And what's also very interesting about this inspirational intelligence is that at the same time it enables us to conceive of ourselves and our place in the cosmos in new and more expansive ways. So instead of the artificial intelligence that promises an extension of survival and material life, inspirational intelligence, such as Einstein's perceptions of relativity, lead to new possibilities for experiencing time, new possibilities for understanding the nature of space and how everything is relative, that might feed back into our imaginations and so lead to greater and greater perceptions of things. There's a related area here because I think our understanding of knowledge is going to have to embrace subjective ways of knowing much more once again, rather than prioritising the objective knowledge that science so brilliantly delivers. There's a kind of intelligence, awareness of life that is only available when you've undergone it. This is why spiritual practices will stress initiations, will stress disciplines that keep you engaged more and more with being able to say yes to things. That kind of unfolding and inspiration only occurs through a direct engagement, participation from within life. You have to change in order for more of life to open up to you. And that's lost when the stress is put on objective ways of knowing which try to exclude the human factors, seeing them as foibles, again, as modern transhumanism might try to do. The valuing of awareness from the inside out, from the undergone towards, from the direct gnosis rather than the kind of epistemological understanding that sees itself as extracted from life. That too is a key part of Dante's vision of transhumanizing, which is of course why he describes it as a journey full of encounters, full of troubles, as well as moments of revelation as he undergoes this expansion of his knowledge, which is at once a growth and transformation of his intelligence. A fourth area has to do with life amongst the stars. Part of the transhumanist dream now is that we will leave planet Earth through development of technology, first of all perhaps populating the moon or populating Mars and then spreading out further, in principle at least right across the galaxy, if not becoming intergalactic at some distant promised future. Now again, Dante is very interested in life amongst the stars in his transhumanizing, but conceives of it in a completely different way. This is a kind of journeying into the conscious, into the cosmos via consciousness rather than via literal travel in space rockets. And it works by, again, a kind of expansion of the sharing of our consciousness with cosmic consciousness. This is actually a very old idea. Even a supposed materialist like Epicurus, the founder of, or he's the most successful propagator of atomism in the ancient world, the idea that we're made up of lots of different particles. He was known to have journeyed across the cosmos in his mind. Lucretius, in his great poem celebrating Epicurus, says this. And the reason for that, I think, is that although Epicurus was a propagator of atomism, it wasn't the dead atomism, the materialism of the modern world that he understood by that. He thought that these particles were kind of particles of living consciousness. He talked about soul atoms as much as grosser material atoms. And so still, even in that materialist conception from the ancient world, there was a transhumanizing possible that was about the expansion of consciousness that could know itself as being part of the cosmic consciousness. And so I think that is what Dante would argue we need to reconsider. The human mind can unite the cosmos in its investigation of the cosmos. You know, you might say we've already travelled back to the Big Bang in our minds before we've even really mastered how to move from Earth to the moon in our bodies. And that kind of unification of all things in the human mind for Dante is, of course, an echo or reflection of the way that the divine mind holds all things together. Life amongst the stars is already possible for us. And I think that Dante's point now, where he's speaking to the transhumanism of the modern age, is that that imaginative sharing with the cosmos is a necessary precursor to the mechanical moving out into the cosmos via technology. Because if we are to know of life beyond life on Earth, we need to have moved beyond the ways that we are threatening life on Earth because of exploitation, because of manipulation, because of this sense of progress being mostly in technological terms, mostly in terms of our human survival, mostly in terms of maximizing pleasure in life, that loses touch with these deeper joys, these deeper delights, these deeper capacities that we have to say yes to life. Dante, I think, wouldn't necessarily be against rocket and space travel, but what he would say is that the ethical, but even more importantly, spiritual advance of the human soul through this wider sense of transhumanizing is key if that technological advance is not to simply spread the dangers, spread the destruction that feels so pressing, so possible on Earth. Dante's Transhumanising can help us address that more immediate question before we step out into life amongst the stars in any literal sense. So that's a fourth area in which Dante's Transhumanising challenges the transhumanising of now and says it's necessary to consider that older perception if the modern transhumanising is not to go horribly wrong. And then the fifth area has to do with death. Now, in a way, this is the most important of all and embraces and brings together much of the older perceptions of transhumanising. Modern transhumanising promises an overcoming of death in two ways. One, quite straightforwardly within a materialist understanding of the nature of reality, and another in a more spiritual context, but that is as dangerous and risky, I think, as the first. Now, the first is the idea that human beings will overcome death by technological means. Either we will develop the capacity to fix our bodies, tune our bodies, hone our bodies, so that death will become more and more of a distant horizon, and effectively we'll be able to live longer and longer lives, perhaps in principle live forever. Or if that's not possible, then we'll be able to cryogenically preserve our bodies and be revived at some point when that overcoming of death has been achieved. That is one way in which modern transhumanising promises an answer to death. A second way is in a more spiritual domain. You see this in some New Age movements. You see it in the thought of thinkers like Sri Aurobindo. And here the idea is that by spiritual practice, our material body can be changed to the extent that it no longer dies. We become supermen. My friend Jules Evans has been writing a lot about how the idea of the Superman is very widespread in modern New Age circles. And a key part of that is the promise that death will be no more. But what's fascinating about Dante's Transhumanising and also other spiritual traditions is that death is not overcome. Rather, death is seen as the path into more life. So there aren't the supermen that don't die. There are all people that always die, but can know that death is a pathway, in fact, the pathway into more life. Now, how does this come about? How is this understood in Dante's conception? It's by the realization that the sense of the separate, isolated self, which he had struggled with in the Inferno and the Purgatorio, lets go of itself, and in that letting go welcomes in the all, the more, which is what he learns to do in the Paradise. That's not a dissolution of himself into the whole, but is an understanding of himself that always already was part of this whole. And it happens through, for example, his mortal anxieties being let go as he becomes more identified with the immortal side of himself. And this is not straightforward to do because, for example, and to begin to feed back to the earlier points, it requires being able to say yes to life, even to the side of life that he knows he will experience as suffering, which itself brings the awareness, the knowledge that his life is always already part of the divine life. His finite sense of himself, he realizes, can be known as many portals, channels, reflections, indicators of the infinite. But it's by embracing the finite side of life that infinity unfolds, not by refusing it, resisting it, trying to stretch it, as modern transhumanising suggests, into a kind of indefinite infinity. It's by knowing that what's most imminent, close to him, proximate, is actually the source of transcendence. He realises that his breath is but a reflection of the breath of God, that the mystery that's within himself is part of the mystery of God, that what he loves as beautiful also exceeds his capacity to love it. And so that becomes a pathway into loving more and knowing more and more beauty. This narrow sense of self that yearns, that longs, that hopes for more must be gone into, but at the same time let go of, in order that this transhumanizing process can take place. This inspirational intelligence is part of this dynamic as well. So, for example, he learns that the more he goes out of himself, loses himself, offers himself, sacrifices what he has to those and the world around him, the more he realizes that he actually stays within his true self, discovers that divine core that always was present but was occluded when he was concerned or worried that if he gave himself away, he would be losing himself in a death that would be the end of himself rather than the discovery of himself. And this is an inspirational kind of intelligence because Dante sees that this going out that opens up, this death, which is actually the key to living, is part of the world around him. So, for example, you might say in more modern terms that the phenomena that Dante encounters in life, in the Inferno he'd seen as a threat, in the Purgatory he'd seen as sharing life with him, and so had developed in communion with the souls and with the facets of the natural world that he encounters in Purgatory. But now in the Paradise, he realizes that those phenomena, by giving of themselves, expressing themselves, communing with others, actually show what is within them that remains within part of the life of God. The appearance speaks of the deeper mystery of which it is but an appearance. And so he develops this capacity with his intelligence to penetrate more and more deeply into the heart of things and into the heart of himself, and so know that within himself and all things is the divine presence. That is the transhumanizing, that dying to himself and so becoming awoken to more and more life. So you might say, to put it in another way, that his biological, material, mortal body is an expression of the infinite, immortal, spiritual presence that is the source and ground of the biological, of the mortal. And in an echo and reflection of the natural process of getting older and dying, he is able to embrace that, and instead of seeing it as a decline he must refuse or resist or try to overcome with the means at his disposal, he sees how it is a becoming into the ground and the source of his biological and mortal life. You might say that in time is the unfolding of what is the case in eternity. Death is no more, not because it's been refused or overcome or imagined away by some strange spiritual materialism that thinks by practice we can change the very material nature of our body. Rather, he understands that even death need not be said no to. Transhumanizing the Dante way is to say yes even to that facet of life, because it too is part and parcel of the divine vision of life, which his transhumanizing increasingly helps him to embrace. So, 5 ways in which modern transhumanizing might learn from the originator of the word, both to set us on a truer path for our humanity and also to avoid a lot of the risks that come up, the dangers that press in when a narrower version of transhumanizing is setting the agenda. When it comes to telepathy, don't think about getting wired up to everybody, which inevitably causes chaos, but think first about how we can embrace the unity and through sympathy and emotional connection, empathy, understand our unity. And then telepathy will follow, Dante would suggest, through intimations, through synchronicities, through perceptions that come to us. Secondly, when it comes to happiness, don't think about technology as the means to deliver increasing amounts of undisturbed pleasure and getting rid of those parts of life, even those people in life that would disturb that pleasure. Instead, think of happiness as embracing a love of more and more of life, a capacity to see more and more that's beautiful in life, and particularly this expansive kind of beauty that maybe not apparent immediately, even you might say the beauty of suffering that enables a yes to be said to the whole of life, and in that is the divine happiness that Dantean transhumanism promises. Thirdly, when it comes to intelligence, don't just reduce that to the manipulation of greater and greater amounts of data, because whilst that can deliver useful things, it can't deliver the insight, the inspiration, the intuition that actually figures like Einstein had said is at the heart of genuine scientific progress, which is really a revolution of paradigms, not just a development of the current state of play. But it also enables us human beings to reimagine ourselves, and so prepares us for what the technological advances might bring, so that they don't become nightmares but become part of, in the service of, our spiritual transformation, our return to the divine wellspring. And so that is the fourth area too, that life amongst the stars is actually possible now in our imaginations, and that by understanding how we're at one with the cosmos is crucial for developing our ethical capacities to live amongst the stars, perhaps literally at some point in the future. But then fifthly is this point of death, because within all those dynamics is the ability to let go of what we feel is absolutely crucial and so important now, in order that the more can be let in. And I think this, in a way, is always the test case for discerning a true from a false transhumanizing. If a transhumanizing is based on overcoming death, either by technological means or by some kind of esoteric spiritual practice, you can be sure that something fundamental is going wrong. And that the transhumanizing that says yes even to death and is open to how it might be the pathway to more life, that is the key test, because then nothing needs to be said no to. Everything can be said yes to, and so everything can be increasingly known consciously by we human beings who are promised that we have been made in the image of God, going to become capable more and more of participating in that fullness of life. if we can say yes to the whole of life, and so move from the nothingness of our creation into the infinite life that was the source of our life.